Hello everyone, welcome to the Q1 feature of Summer Seamstress. This is dedicated to those of you who might be starting out as knitting and crocheting hobbyists, and I'm going to share with you some things that I've learned along the way. I come from a long lineage of women who are creators, and I sadly learned nothing because I didn't have the patience to sit still when they were around. I was relegated to threading needles because that was what I was useful for. I did try to knit when I was a young child under the guidance of my grandma and my mom, and I didn't really stick with it. But I did start again when I was 40 years old, which is now 13 years ago, and it all washed over me when I was pregnant with my first child. So some people talk about nesting. For me, it was dropping $100 randomly at AC Moore. I'm going to share with you now things I've learned over the past 13 years. So first things first, I want to share, this is one of my makes. It's called the Best of Both Tunic Top by Sally Melville, and it's just wonderful. Check out Sally Melville. This is not a perfect garment, and I don't care. I love it. I wear it with pride. I'm going to make another one, and I want to say I actually made one then in very expensive yarn, and I wound up making a mistake right at the end and regrettably throwing it away. So I'm going to share some things here which maybe will help you avoid that. I have learned now when something isn't working, you put it in timeout. And if you have the space to store it somewhere, you can bring it back when your mind is clear, and it's quite possible to save things. So, tip number 1, keep it simple. Your first projects should be things that you can stitch in rectangles and squares, things that will be really easy to just go back and forth and back and forth. Look for simple patterns that don't have a lot of different stitches. Maybe just focus on 1 or 2 types of stitches, and so you can perfect that pattern with your hands. Don't worry about something called gauge right away. That's why scarves, I think, are great. Gauge is a way of measuring your stitches, and blankets and scarves don't care. Washcloths don't care. If it's a little bigger or smaller than what the gauge originally said, it's not going to be a big deal, and no one's going to notice. My first project was a baby blanket. Don't overwhelm yourself with a complicated pattern for the first several projects, or maybe ever. Maybe you just want to make things in rectangles and squares, and that's totally fine. You can make a whole lot with that. Start with larger size yarn. So the smaller the yarn, potentially the more difficult it is to work with. That's how I feel. And when I say difficult, it's just harder to see. It's harder to see, and you're using smaller needles when you're using smaller yarn. So for me, that requires a lot more concentration. It also requires a lot more patience, because when you're using smaller yarn, it's going to take longer to complete your project. If you are looking for purchasing yarn, I would say worsted weight, or bulky or chunky, or any of those kinds of larger, thicker sizes and larger needles to work with them, or hooks if you're crocheting, will be way better in the beginning. They'll be much more satisfying, and you can turn out your projects quickly. Then you can progress to smaller yarns and smaller needles once you get more confidence with your skills. Tip number 2, you get what you pay for. So for some people, Michael's and Joann's are the only sources of where you can find your yarn and supplies. And that's where I started, at the big box stores. I soon learned, though, that some of the yarns I was working with were difficult to work with in my hands. They made my hands feel uncomfortable. Sometimes bits of the fibers would get in my skin. Sometimes I would be breathing it in or getting it in my eyes. And it was really problematic. I have since learned that there is an enormous range of quality of yarn. So when you're first getting started, it's not the biggest deal if you're maybe purchasing some items from these stores, but once you're underway, or if you have the means to just start at a local yarn shop, I just say go there. Find your local yarn shops and just walk around. Most of the time, no one's going to pressure you to buy anything. You could just go in there and look. They're also generous with their time too. So if you have questions, they'll help you. They might have classes. You can purchase less, but purchase higher quality. Tip number 3. Beware the shiny object syndrome. So I just recommended you go visit your local yarn shop and you might really fall down a big rabbit hole. You can go overboard really fast. You have to know how much time you have to make this stuff. You are not going to be able to make all the things you think you're going to be able to make. So prioritize. And tip number 4. Check for mistakes often and use a lifeline. You've got your quality yarn, you've got your tools, you've got a pattern that you can understand, you've got a picture of the finished product, and you can't wait to have that finished product. And then you get going and you notice a mistake. The first thing is don't freak out. You don't have to be afraid of mistakes. You need to know how to fix them and how to address them, because everybody's going to make mistakes. Trust me, everybody's going to make mistakes. When you're knitting, check every time you get to the end of a row. Check the number of stitches and look at your work. At the end of each row would be ideal, because if you've made a mistake, if it's in that row, it's way easier to fix it than if you keep going and now that mistake is several rows down. You can unwork your project most of the time, like you can knit backwards, and it takes way longer to knit backwards than it does to knit forwards, or at least it does for me. So I want to prevent as many mistakes as possible or correct them as soon as I can. The other way to address mistakes is to insert lifelines into your garments. You see these yellow strands of yarn are not part of the garment here. They're part of this garment. And this scarf is going to be a whole pile of colors, but none of them are yellow. So I am inserting with a larger tapestry needle this yarn every certain number of stitches, and I'm making a note in the pattern where those lifelines are, so that if I already had to do it, actually, I was watching the Friends reunion and it was late and I was watching the TV too much and not looking down, and I left a hole somewhere here when I was already up here, and I didn't like how it looked when I tried to fix it the other way. So because that lifeline was there, I said, you know what? It's going to take me forever to knit backwards. I'm just going to rip it all down to here and start again. And it was easy. I got a good night's sleep and I was able to recover, and it looks nice and clean. I forgot 2 important things, so here's some pictures of a latest sweater I completed. You also want to make sure you're working with enough light. There's nothing surer to promote mistakes than not being able to see what you're doing. Also, you want to be able to keep notes on a pattern, where you are. If the doorbell rings, the phone rings, you put down your work and you come back to it, you're going to be in trouble if you don't remember where you left off. Write on your pattern where you are. So I put Post-its. I always usually use a paper pattern, like a printout, and I write on a Post-it where I am, so that if you get interrupted and you have to walk away from your project, you can come back and see what you were doing. Don't trust your memory to remember where you are, what row you're on. Have some method of writing down exactly what you're doing. And if you do things like lifelines, write down what row it was in, where you were, so that if you have to go back to that area, you know where to pick up again. My final tip is seek out your community. So all of the things I mentioned before, a community will help you. There's online communities and there's plenty of communities in person these days. And there's no substitute I feel, for those communities. Am I with them all the time? No. But when I tried to make my first baby blanket and I was messing everything up, the community of Ravelry helped me understand what I was doing wrong in my stitching, and I was able to correct my mistakes and make a successful blanket. Your local yarn shop will surely be able to direct you to places where you can meet others. They might even host it themselves. Your local library could be a place to check. Get yourself a few books that you enjoy. I would say just start at the library. Don't buy anything. Go to the library or just peruse through your bookstore, because you can see what kind of material speaks to you. I think it's really helpful to have at least one book that is about like a glossary, encyclopedias of fiber arts. You can also go to YouTube, and that's really helpful because you can rewind that video and watch it over and over again. However, I do think having the books on hand is also an equally good resource. There's something. Okay, so just as a summary, tip number 1, start small. Projects that are in squares and rectangles are going to be your friend while you're getting started and learning your skills. Work with larger yarn and needles and hooks so it's easier for you to see what you're doing and your project can get completed faster. Tip number 2, you get what you pay for. If your budget permits it, I suggest going straight to the local yarn store and not visiting the big box shops if you can avoid it. You're going to be so much happier with the quality of the yarn, which will make your experience of knitting so much better. Tip number 3, especially if you go straight to the local yarn shop, avoid shiny object syndrome. There's lots of things that are so beautiful out there that you're going to feel like you have to have, but just stick with the project requirements at this time and you'll have opportunity to invest in new products as you need them for each project. Tip number 4, check for your mistakes often, learn how to fix mistakes, and use a lifeline. You'll thank me for that one. And finally, tip number 5, find a community. See where you can connect with other people in person. It's so enjoyable. And get a couple books that you can have on hand to expand your knowledge and help you when you're in a jam. If you've enjoyed what I've shared with you, please hit like and share any comments below. I look forward to sharing more information with you in the future. One final comment on finished products. It may take you a really long time to create your finished product. I know it does for me. I don't know how I can knit so slowly, especially after all this time, but I do. And I've learned that I have to be okay with that. This isn't my job. It's not my full-time job. It's a hobby. It's something I do for pleasure. It's something I do to give people I love special handmade gifts. Once in a while, I might sell an item, but in no way does the sale of that item even recover usually the materials it costs to create, much less the time I took to put into creating it. You make sure that you love what you're doing when you are creating this project. Do not bring your baggage into your knitted projects. Don't make this a reason to feel bad about yourself when you're learning something new. Encourage yourself, learn at the pace you're comfortable with, and do not judge where you are in this journey. You can really make yourself feel miserable if you are comparing your projects to other people's work, or you feel like you aren't learning all the things you want to learn. You're exactly fine where you are. If you just make garter stitch scarves for the rest of the time you knit and you love doing that, happy knitting. Happy knitting, friends.